Welcome back to the Explainer, everyone. You know, when we picture ancient Egypt, we usually just see this monument of eternal stability, right? Pyramids, gold, pharaohs who ruled like gods. But like any great epic, this story actually has a prequel. Today, we're skipping past the golden age of the pharaohs and diving headfirst into a chaotic, super fragmented, and honestly pretty mysterious era that laid the actual groundwork for the whole civilization. So, it begs the question, what exactly came before the First Dynasty? For the longest time, history books basically just started the clock right there, kind of acting as if this fully unified, absolute monarchy just popped into existence out of thin air. But the reality? The unified ancient Egypt we all know actually rose from a largely forgotten, heavily divided time. To really appreciate the heights of Egyptian civilization, we have to look back at the crucible of conflict and ambition that literally forged it. And that brings us to this incredibly fascinating concept known as Dynasty Zero, or Dynasty Zero. Basically, this term refers to the earliest kings who ruled over territories in Egypt just before the reign of the legendary Menes. Menes, of course, being the founder of the First Dynasty and the great unifier of Egypt. Historically speaking, this Dynasty Zero era sits right at the very end of what we call the pre-dynastic period. Archaeologically, we're looking at the final phase of the Naqada culture, specifically a phase called Naqada III. It's right here, in this tight proto-dynastic window, that we see the absolute very first sparks of true Egyptian royalty starting to take shape. Now, what's truly wild about this is the sheer compression of time. We are looking at a super tight window, especially in the grand scheme of Bronze Age history. Dynasty Zero is established around 3200 BCE, and then it's totally done roughly 1 century later, around 3100 BC, literally just 100 years. But man, within that single century, the region went through massive transformations. By roughly 3150 BCE, the whole territory was just embroiled in constant, fierce conflict. This wasn't some peaceful, slow evolution. It was a century of clashing factions violently battling it out for dominance, until the First Dynasty finally broke through.
Section 1. Upper versus Lower Egypt.
All right, to really grasp this chaotic century, we've got to picture the map. Ancient Egypt back then was totally split. Down in the south, we have Upper Egypt, which is actually where Egyptian royalty first started to rise. This southern territory was organized into 3 distinct, identified proto-kingdoms. Opposing them, way up in the north, we have Lower Egypt, which was primarily populated by the people of the lush Nile Delta. And these two groups, the southern proto-kingdoms of Upper Egypt and the northern folks of the Delta, they were locked in a bitter, non-stop struggle for supremacy. So why were they fighting so much? Well, it really just boils down to economics. Most of Dynasty Zero was spent at war with the Delta people, but the Upper Egyptian rulers weren't just fighting for patches of sand. They were fighting for the economy. They absolutely needed to control and protect the super lucrative trade routes that stretched all the way up to the Levant. Whoever controlled the Delta basically controlled the faucet of invaluable resources flowing into Egypt. We're talking vital wood, wine, and other critical commodities that you just couldn't find locally in the southern deserts. It was a brutal war for economic survival, and, let's be honest, luxury. Now, you might be wondering, if this period was so long ago and so chaotic, how on earth do we even know who was in charge?
Section 2. Traces in the clay. The answer, as always, is in the artifacts. Take a look at this inscription here. It represents a pretty obscure early ruler named Iri Hor, and it was found at Eastern Qom in Tel El Farqa. See, during Dynasty Zero, these kings weren't carving their names into giant limestone pyramids yet. Instead, they inscribed them on much simpler surfaces, like everyday pottery and the walls of early tombs. These specific types of name inscriptions are called serekhs, and these serekhs are absolutely crucial. They're basically literal fingerprints left in the clay that prove these proto-kings actually existed long before the First Dynasty.
And because of this, we can physically map out where these rulers were laid to rest. Like, check out the map of the early tombs at Omelkop. Iri Hor's tomb is made up of 2 separate chambers, B1 and B2, while another ruler, King Ka's tomb, is located right nearby. Now tie that physical geography to the actual vessel found at Tarkan. Painted right onto its surface is the serekh of that exact same King Ka. It is just incredible to be able to connect the physical burial spaces of these early kings directly to the everyday objects bearing their names. And you can still go view stuff like this today in places like the Petrie Museum in London.
Section 3. Meet the Proto-Kings. Okay, so who exactly were these rulers? Down in the south, the royal lineage is truly something else. Long before we get the grand familiar names like Ramses or Amenhotep, these leaders identified themselves with raw, visceral forces of nature. Get this. We have kings named Fingersnail, Elephant, Stork, Bull, scorpion eye, crocodile, and of course the ones we just mentioned, Ifrihor and Ka. These names sound a bit wild, almost alien compared to later pharaohs, don't they? But they project this untamed energy that honestly perfectly matches the violent, hyper-competitive Naqada III period they were living in.
But Upper Egypt for sure didn't have a monopoly on royalty. Up in the Delta, the northern rivals had their own fierce lineage of leaders pushing back against that southern expansion. It's a completely different list of obscure kings up there. The historical record gives us rulers like Heju-Hor, Ni-Nith, Hot-Hor, and some incredibly unique ones like Double Falcon and Wash. These northern kings were the guys literally holding the line, fiercely guarding those invaluable Levant trade routes from the encroaching proto-kingdoms of the south. There is one specific ruler who beautifully bridges the gap between myth and history, and that's Pharaoh Scorpion II. Carved right into the famous Scorpion Macehead, which is currently hanging out in the Ashmolean Museum. His incredible detail is just undeniable. He's arguably one of the most notable figures attributed to Dynasty 0. And his name is super fascinating too, because it might actually refer to or derive from the goddess Serket. She was this special early protector of other deities and rulers. So right here on this artifact, we're seeing that early blending of royal power and divine protection. That combination would go on to become the absolute hallmark of all future Egyptian pharaohs.
Section 4. The Great Unification.
But look, a divided nation cannot stay at war forever, right? The century of chaos eventually had to reach a breaking point, and that climax arrives with a singular figure, the legendary Menes. Now, historically, Menes is very often associated with Narmer, though sometimes folks propose his successor Hora-Aha. But it's Narmer who definitively shuts down the violence of Dynasty 0. He is credited as the first king of the First Dynasty and, most importantly, the very first unifier of Egypt. By finally bringing Upper and Lower Egypt together under one absolute monarchy, Narmer closed the book on the proto-kingdoms. He officially launched the grand narrative of ancient Egypt, a narrative that would endure for millennia.
Which brings us to a final thought to reflect on for today's explainer. We started out by picturing ancient Egypt as this eternal, stable monument of history. But now, knowing about the violent, chaotic prequel of Dynasty 0, this wild century of kings named Crocodile and Scorpion fighting tooth and nail over wine and wood, how does that change the way you view that stability? The great First Dynasty didn't just casually happen. It was fiercely fought for. It was forged in the fires of a deeply divided land. Honestly, it makes those towering pyramids seem even more impressive when you realize just how fragmented the world was that they were built upon. Thanks for hanging out with me on this explainer, and remember to keep questioning the history behind the monuments.